at Home series, our virtual museum tours. I am Sheila Byers. I am the host for the program today, and we have a special guest for our Beaty at Home series, Dr. Rick Taylor, who is a professor of zoology at UBC and director of the Beaty Biodiversity Museum's fish collection. We also have Nancy Lee, who is one of the other interpreters at the museum, who will be facilitating and helping out with the chat, as well as Nicole there, our supervisor actually of the education outreach program, and looking after Facebook. So we are on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people here at UBC, and we encourage you to check out their website to learn more about them. And I think the flag, which was raised at UBC in 2019, is very appropriate for our tour today, with this lovely rendition of a salmon and the gravel bed in which they spawn their egg for the female. For those of you who have not been to the Beaty Biodiversity Museum, we are at the far west.
Apologies, one moment here.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so at the far west end of Point Grey of the city of Vancouver, or the cosmopolitan city of Vancouver, way out at the tip at UBC, we are in the vicinity of the aquatic ecosystems research laboratories. We're near the engineering building. We're near the earth sciences building. And if anybody's been up here and know the bookstore, we're quite close to that. So many places to visit if you were to come to the museum. We are open. Sorry, let me turn this off. From Tuesdays to Sundays, 10 until 5. So do come and visit. And I should say Museum of Anthropology is open, the Botanical Gardens and many other museums open as well. So you can certainly spend your entire day visiting the area. So from Main Mall, this is what the museum looks like. Here is the Aero building, or the aquatic research laboratories building lab. And here we have the Biodiversity Research Center, and we are directly connected. The museum is directly connected to the BRC, and you can barely just see this outline in the background, which is our big blue whale specimen. The Biodiversity Research Center has 50 plus faculty and students, all of whom are focusing on biodiversity, that diversity of life, as we call it, focusing on ecology, evolution, taxonomy, communities, conservation, climate change, mathematics, genetics. So you can tell from that the biodiversity not only is diverse organisms, but it has a diverse number of perspectives that we can approach research to better understand it. And of course, here's our big, attractive blue whale skeleton right at the entrance to the museum. It is the largest specimen that we have, and many people who see this from the outside are immediately attracted to it, as are we. But there are many other organisms that are smaller that are in our collections. We have over 2.1 million specimens that were initially all over the campus before the museum was built. And now they are all archived in the museum, which means that they are getting better protection for the long term, and that's what's very important. I'm going to be very biased to say that one of my favorite specimens is the glass sponge that are found locally and have very important ecosystems. But indeed, we do have 6 different collections. They are all color coded. So we have the tetrapods, which are mammals, lizards, amphibians in this brown color. Anything with 4 limbs or ancestors used to have 4 limbs. Then of course, well, I know I'm biased again with the marine invertebrates, but we have abalone here, showing some of the spectacular sorts of specimens that we have. Here in green is, green is our herbarium representatives, fungus, but we also have vascular, non-vascular plants like lichens and bryophytes. Insects in purple, anything from centipedes up to spiders and scorpions. A nice diversity of insects that we have in the museum. And fish in blue, and you can see that the majority of that is contained in an alcohol solution. And then finally in red, we have our fossils. So we are in fact now down inside the museum, and you can see what some of these fish cabinets look like with the jars inside. Now, the museum was only built in 2010, yet some of the specimens that we have archived here are well over 100 years old. And in fact, I believe some of the fish collection date back as far as 1904. And in fact, the fish collection is the largest one we have, which is over 800,000 specimens. It also is the 3rd largest in Canada, if I recall. So, floor plan, here's our big blue whale at the front of the museum, brown for our tetrapods, yellow for our marine invertebrates, green for the herbarium, very large. Insects, just one small row, but obviously they're small and we get lots of specimens in those cabinets. Here's our fish collection and our fossil collection at the back, all color coded. So as much as I'd like to spend some time talking about our big blue whale, I'd sooner that we move on to the fish, because I think this is one of the ones that our guest speaker is going to talk about. So, would not necessarily talk about, but hopefully cover. So it is my pleasure to introduce Rick Taylor, and he is going to talk to you about the diversity of freshwater fishes and a guide that he has also available. So I will stop sharing and let you pick it up. Rick, welcome to you.
Okay, thanks, Sheila. Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for taking the time to join us for this Beaty at Home. Yeah, I'm going to talk about freshwater fishes and some of the resources we have to help people who want to be able to better identify them. I'm going to start sharing my screen right now. There we go. So hopefully everybody can see that.
Yes.
Good, very good. Okay, so basically, I've got 15 or so slides, and I want to talk about BC's underwater wonders, or a fish by any other name. Now, when we started this session, where people were coming in, we asked people to tell us where they were from and what their favorite fish was. And virtually everybody picked a marine fish. So those of you, and understandably, because some of my, I can never pick my favorite fish, but I have a list sort of 10 of my favorite types of fishes, and certainly there are some marine fish in there, but I'm not going to talk at all about marine fishes today. I'm going to talk about our freshwater fishes. So you can just give a thumbs up, that little reaction thing on your button. How many people out there are bird watchers? Is there anybody who's a bird watcher? Yeah, there you go. Okay, we got at least one. I've sort of lately I've become a bit of an amateur bird watcher, and birds are amazing. They really are. And the thing is, they're really easy to see. So here we have BC is endowed with incredible freshwater resources, beautiful streams and beautiful lakes. And if you walked along this stream or around this lake, you'd be able to record all sorts of birds. You'd see birds even with the naked eye. You wouldn't need a binocular. You look at these rivers and streams and lakes, and unless you've been under them, many people think, well, there's really nothing there, or there can't be much there. The fish are really, really hard to see. And particularly for lakes and rivers in north temperate environments like we live in, because they can be chilly. So you have to go, there's a shortened time when you can go, and sometimes you have to be prepared by having a dry suit or something like that, or a wetsuit if you're not going in the heat of the summer. But really, if you have had the opportunity to go under lakes and streams of British Columbia, there are a wonder of things to see. And I've just got one short little video clip here of an example. So this is taken in a relatively small, something between a river and a stream, fairly recently. And you can see it's not very deep. You can see clearly the sun coming through the top. And all these amazing fish are swimming along. They're assembling actually for sort of a pre-spawning migration into a tributary. I'll just keep going because there really are beautiful looking animals, just perfect prime specimens. That one's got a bit of a gill issue, but anyway.
So are those white stripes on the fins, Rick, important for identifying?
Well, there is, if we, okay, well, let's just stop this here. Well, we got a screenshot. Good point. First of all, does anybody know what these fish are? What they might be? I can see how you might get confused between two or three types, but anybody want to hazard a guess? Well, then you need my resources, clearly. So the white trailing edges on the fins, well, the first thing you notice is this fish here, and this gets right into how one identifies fishes. There are lots of different ways we do it. Now, obviously, if you've taken university courses or even senior high school courses, everyone knows what the dichotomous key, this document that has choices with questions, sometimes with words that are like Cyrillic, written in Cyrillic or something, really hard to understand some of the terms. And you get choices and you say yes or no, and that moves you down the key and you eventually identify the fish. Well, coloration and spotting is something that we use a lot to identify fishes, whether they be freshwater or marine. Now, these fish have clearly a very distinct pattern. And you notice that there are light spots. What I mean by that is they're either white or in some cases they're orange here, some of these fish, on a relatively dark background. That's a dead giveaway in the Northern Hemisphere for fishes of the genus Savelinus, that is char, lake trout, brook trout, Dolly Varden char, bull trout, et cetera, and there's some in Asia as well. The white tips and the fins are also pretty much dead giveaways for char, particularly during the spawning and pre-spawning period in adults. Now, some fish, like some salmon, do get some white tips to their fins, but not as extravagant as these fish have. So we'll just finish this off because it's such a cool video. Okay, so those are bull trout.
Okay, sorry. Yep, sorry to interrupt. Just to say that we did have a couple of guesses of lake trout, brook trout, and I think there was one bull trout.
Good, excellent. Well, you get definitely part marks because you didn't say it was a salmon or a true trout. You got the fact that it was a char, which is correct. And in fact, those are bull trout. Okay, so now, where are you going to get to see? So if you can't walk around with binoculars, well, you could, but you'd ruin them pretty quickly to see fish. If you're interested, where can I see live fishes, live freshwater fishes? Well, if you can be, if you're an angler, you're definitely going to see fish. If you take opportunities to go to some of the spawning channels in British Columbia or hatcheries in the fall, such as the Weaver Creek spawning channel near Harrison Mills, which I recommend. That's a really good place to see. You can see 3 species. This year, you'll be able to see sockeye, pink, and chum salmon. You can get right next to them. Or if you do engage, as sometimes I do, I used to do a lot more frequently than I do now, but if you snorkel in the summer even along if you have if you go to a lake in the summer or even an easy stream, it can be a little tricky to snorkel in streams, but that's a great way to see fishes, is just get a mask and snorkel on a hot summer day and just go right along the shore of a lake or in a gentle stream, and you'll see lots of fish. And of course, there are lots of careers in fish biology and fisheries where people are sampling fish to see what kinds are there, how many are there, how it changes from year to year. And you got to know what the fish are, so that what the species are, so you record the right species composition and species abundance, etc. So there are ways. It's a little more difficult than bird watching, but there are ways in which you can see fish. And often, if you ever snorkel, you'll be snorkeling along and you'll be looking ahead and you'll see a fish under there and a fish under there. And if you just turn around behind you, sometimes you'll see a lot of fish that have gathered behind you, little fish, particularly little salmon and trout, because you're acting like a big log and slowing the water down, and they love to hide in little places like that and grab food. So always look behind you sometimes when you're snorkeling. But these are places you can see fish, freshwater fishes on your own. Now, as I mentioned before, when we talk about biodiversity of fishes, this is what, if you do a word association game, this is what jumps into people's mind. Some incredibly diverse, beautiful tropical reef, or seahorses, because first of all, they're the only fish that swims standing up, and they're just really cool. The males carry the eggs to term. So they've got a lot of really interesting features, and they just sort of dance along in the water and they swim upright. So they're really cool. But most people tend to think of marine fishes. This is one of my top 10 fishes. This is a yellow tang, this incredibly beautiful fish of the Indo-West Pacific. So this is what people tend to think of. But you'd be mistaken. Because really, freshwaters are the champions of fish diversity. Remember, fishes are the most diverse in terms of the number of species, diverse group of vertebrates. There are more species of fish than all other vertebrate groups combined. There's over 35,000, and there's probably close to 100,000. We just haven't described most of them yet. So this is a little graph that shows some comparative figures. On the left here, we have the area of aquatic habitat. And you can see, so the dark blue are marine systems, marine waters, and the light blue are freshwater surface systems. And you can see that the total surface area of freshwater surface systems on Earth is minuscule, tiny, it's about 0.01% of all the water on the Earth in terms of surface area is freshwater. But if you look over at the right, this is the number of described species of fishes in freshwater in light blue and in marine systems in dark blue. And you can see that freshwater fishes constitute about 44% of all known described species. So per unit area, and if you do this by per unit volume, it's even more staggering. Freshwater, these things that look barren if you look at them just at the surface, have over 41 times as many species per unit area as do marine systems. Most marine systems are barren wastelands. Now, don't throw anything at me, Sheila, but we think of coastal areas, coastal upwelling areas, and coral reefs are spectacularly diverse. And there's nothing more amazing than swimming on a coral reef, for sure, to see diversity. But don't underestimate the diversity we see in fishes. And in fact, some people think that the reason for this is, freshwaters are broken up a lot more. You've got isolated lakes. Rivers tend to be isolated from other rivers by terrestrial landscape. So the habitat of freshwater fishes is chopped up a lot more, and this tends to encourage speciation. Anywho, also freshwater fishes, despite the greater press often that marine fishes get in terms of overexploitation and endangerment, things like sharks, and there's definitely big problems there, and tuna, big problems there for sure. But as a group, freshwater fishes are way, way, way more imperiled than our marine fishes. And this is because they're entombed within a terrestrial landscape. Anything that happens on the land eventually ends up in the water. And freshwaters don't have the buffer that many marine systems do. So this is an article that came out less than 2 weeks ago, an opinion piece in the Globe and Mail. So I encourage you to look at it. It's about how Canada is failing its freshwater fish populations. I'm not going to get into that right now, because it can be a bit of a downer, but the 2 points I wanted to make at the beginning were fishes are a lot more diverse in freshwater than you think, and we're really doing a poor job of protecting them. And Canada's certainly not alone in that. So let's look at the BC, let's home in a bit and look at the BC freshwater fish fauna as a group. And this is just a pie chart showing the number of described species in Canada. There's about 213 total, 213, 215 of things with distinct scientific names. That's less than half of what Mexico has, for instance, in freshwater. And you can see BC has about 67 and Ontario has 122. So BC is relatively on the low end, is at the low end in terms of described freshwater fish diversity. And we'll get into some reasons why that might be in a second. Okay, and don't worry, I'm not going to show you too many lists like this, but just to give a snapshot, I wanted to show you some of the sort of highlights of freshwater fish diversity in British Columbia. We have about 15 families, and they go from the lampreys right at the very top down to the perches and things like pickerel at the bottom. And you'll notice, as you'll see a bit later, there's a number of these are native freshwater fishes, but there's also a number of introduced freshwater fishes as well. And British Columbia demonstrates quite sort of classically as part of this general pattern of the so-called latitudinal gradient in species diversity. If you go from the equator north or the equator south, the number of species of a whole range of taxa tend to decline. So here are one of the ways in which we organize freshwater fish biodiversity. This is in major drainage basins. So it's a little hard to see, but you can, and so the lines separate the different drainage basins. This is the Hudson Bay, Yukon Mackenzie. We're in this sort of Cascadian province right here in British Columbia. And there's this rather massive Mississippi drainage and the Great Lakes drainage, which we'll talk about in a second. The numbers you can see here that I've got a few highlighted. These are the number of genera, one level of the sort of taxonomic hierarchy. This is the number of species. And the third number is the percentage of all the species in this sort of aquatic province that are found only in that area, nowhere else in North America. And you can see that down here, the Rio Grande, which the Rio Grande runs sort of down like this, but this is the whole Rio Grande province between Texas and Mexico. It's got 134 genera, or 21 genera, 134 species, 50% of which, of all those species, are found nowhere else in the world except the Rio Grande River system. That's really amazing. If you compare that to Cascadia, which is most of British Columbia, not all of it, we have only 11 genera, about 60 species, and 25% of those are endemic. So we've got half the number of species that are only found in Cascadia as is found in the Rio Grande. If you go up here into the Arctic region, 3 genera of freshwater fishes, 8 species, and none are endemic. So all the freshwater fishes found in the Arctic, this huge, two massive river systems, well more than 20% of the total surface area of Canada, Yukon and Mackenzie rivers. None of those freshwater fish that are found there are restricted to there. They must have come from somewhere else. And you can see 2 reasons why. I mentioned that Ontario had 121 species, and BC has around 67. And you can see 1 reason right at the very top why that might be. The first one, well, the major reason is the Mississippi region, which feeds into all these areas used to drain into the Mississippi in Ontario. So just leading on a bit from that, what are the origins of the fauna we have in British Columbia freshwaters? Well, some of them, but the history of the fishes we have goes much deeper than that. Well, before the sort of 2 million years ago when the major Pleistocene glaciations began. So, and we have a very deep history. So some of the descendants of the very first fishes exist in British Columbia, as we'll see. Point that there's a lot more diversity of freshwater fishes than we might commonly think of. And secondly, that British Columbia has a relatively small number in a sort of pan-Canadian perspective of freshwater fishes. And thirdly, that the diversity we see, the diversity of fishes we have in British Columbia is very dynamic. It's varied over tens of millions of years, and it's going to continue to vary into the future. One of the reasons why, or one of the key aspects of the diversity we see today in British Columbia's freshwater fish fauna is that they were heavily impacted by the 20 or more glaciations that we had over the last 2.8 million years during the Pleistocene. So these were massive ice sheets. The Cordilleran ice sheet covered all of British Columbia, and the Laurentide ice sheet covered the rest of Canada, including a bit of British Columbia. These are ice sheets that were 2 to 3 kilometers thick in places, and all of British Columbia was covered repeatedly by these ice sheets, and they reached their maximum extent, the Cordilleran one, around somewhere between 15 and 18,000 years ago. So clearly, there's 2 little bits that were exposed, weren't covered by ice. This is the northeastern tip of Graham Island in Haida Gwaii, and this is the northwestern tip of Vancouver Island around the Brooks Peninsula. But all the other habitat for freshwater fishes was completely wiped out. So the point is that the fishes we see in British Columbia today in freshwater must have come from somewhere else. We are a province of fish immigrants. And these arrows show the number of species that came from 5 principal areas that were free of ice during these Pleistocene glaciations. The black one up here is Beringia. That's the Yukon, exposed portions of the Yukon River Valley. This is the Nahanni Refuge, which was a seam between the Laurentide and the Cordilleran ice sheets. And as the ice melted, this seam expanded, and this is one of the ways in which humans are thought to have colonized North America. There's the Great Plains Refuge, around 24 species came from here, which is east of the Rocky Mountains. That's what this is a continental divide, this black line here. There's the sort of lower, what I consider the lower Columbia River. That is the Columbia River that is not in British Columbia, which was ice-free. So this is the southern margin of the ice sheet. And then there's the little coastal refugia like the Chehalis River, which was on the Olympic, just south of the Olympic Peninsula, which was a freshwater refuge for fishes separate from the Columbia. So all these things came from different areas to populate what we now have as the freshwater fish fauna of BC. And you can see that the vast majority came from the Columbia River. That's why the Columbia River is often called the master river of Cascadia. And only 3 that we know of came from the Nahanni Refuge. And 64% came, so several species came from multiple refugia, but the vast majority came from only 1 refuge. Now, the way this works is shown pretty nicely here. Now watch the screen down here at the bottom. You see the years changing. And we'll let this run for a couple of times. So this is showing the glacial maximum in North America that starts at around 20,000 years ago, which is going to start right now. So you can see all of the habitat in Canada is basically wiped out. And then as the climate warms, the ice sheets retreat. And you can see these light blue areas. These are progrglacial lakes, huge areas of flooding that formed at the margins of the ice sheets as the ice sheets melted. And you can see here the remnants of them, the Great Lake, the Laurentian Great Lakes, and the other Great Lakes in Canada. And you can see these freshwater lakes were huge, way bigger than the lakes we have today, and they were interconnected. And they allowed fish to disperse all the way from the Mississippi River all the way to the mouth, basically, of the Mackenzie River. So there's a couple of minnows, small cyprinid fishes that did that, that clearly had an origin in the Mississippi, and they've ended up coming all the way north into Canada through this seam here, along the margins of these proglacial lakes, to end up in the Mackenzie River Delta. Really quite amazing. And you can imagine why not that many fishes came, or there are some fishes that came from, there's well over, I don't know, 300 or 400 species of fishes found in the Mississippi River region. And so why doesn't British Columbia have all of these? If some of them could get here and get into British Columbia, why didn't all of them get there? Well, it has to do with the timing of the occurrence of these aquatic superhighways, if you will, and whether or not fishes were able to breach the boundary of the Rocky Mountains by the time these superhighways dissolved. Because clearly, as the region warmed up and the areas dried out, these connections became lost and fish couldn't get from one to the other. So again, this really points out to the fact that our freshwater fish fauna is a really dynamic thing, and glaciation had a huge impact on the number and kinds and distribution of fishes we have today. So I've just got a couple more slides, a relatively small number of slides left to describe some of the diversity we have and some of the tools we have. So another interesting thing about British Columbia is we have the most the highest number of endemic species from a Canadian perspective. So even though we only have about half the number of total species relative to Ontario, we have the highest number of fish species that are found only in one province. And there's 2 sturgeon, 4 lamprey, 2 salmon trout, 5 minnows or cyprinids, 1 sucker, and 4 sculpins. We also have, so these are all things that have separate taxonomic names. We also have literally scores of distinct populations that have diverged genetically through time. And these are considered as separate wildlife species under Canada's Species at Risk Act. So the most famous example, or really the greatest example, is in the Fraser River, sockeye salmon, 1 taxon, Oncorhynchus nerca. There's more than 20 populations in the Fraser River that are considered separate species in terms of the Species at Risk Act. So the point here is there's a lot of so-called hidden or cryptic diversity, things that spawn at different times, migrate very different differences, have different body shapes, different coloration, different behavior, even though they may be called all the same species. So there's lots of different behavioral types of sockeye salmon, even though they're all called Oncorhynchus nerca. And Canada recognizes that legally. And here are just a couple of examples. So we have 5 species of lampreys in British Columbia, some which run to the sea, some which don't, some which are external parasites on other fishes, some which are not. And these 5 species we have today are descendants from the earliest split in the vertebrate tree of life. So in other words, we have representatives of fishes that split off from all the rest of the vertebrates right at the very base of the vertebrate tree. So in other words, there's a huge 500 million year history of fishes in British Columbia. Another example people often talk about as a prehistoric fish, that sort of thing, are the white and green sturgeon, which are found only in British Columbia in terms of relative to the rest of Canada. And they too are descendants, the ones we see today, are descendants of a relatively early split in the fish tree of life. So we have a lot of antiquity in terms of our fish diversity. At the very opposite extreme, we have some of the youngest species on Earth, not just in Canada. And these are the so-called benthic on the bottom and limnetic species pairs of 3-spined sticklebacks that we have in 5 lakes in British Columbia. The only place in the entire world they're found is in 5 lakes in southern British Columbia. And you can clearly, so these are males, there's a benthic male here and a limnetic male, a benthic female, and a limnetic female. You can clearly see the size and the shape differences between these 2 things that we now recognize as distinct species. These things didn't exist before the last glaciation. So unlike the lampreys or sturgeon that might be the descendants of things that diverged tens to hundreds of millions of years ago, these things evolved within the last probably 10 to 12,000 years. So we have some of the youngest species of fish on Earth. We also have a whole bunch of fish that nobody gives a darn about. These are the so-called minnows and suckers that you don't angle for, you rarely see them, they're kind of this big. A lot of them are very small. We call these sort of little brown fishes, but they are really, really crucial to ecosystem functioning. And they're really crucial for providing, in many cases, forage or food for fishes that we do care a lot about, like the rainbow trout. The red-side shiner here is a very, very key prey species for things that rainbow trout that can get very large and people love to fish. And of course, we have the iconic salmon, trout, grayling, and whitefish. Very, very, very popular. The rainbow trout is the most popular sport fish in freshwaters in British Columbia. And the 5 species of Pacific salmon collectively are known as BC's provincial fish. So these things deservedly get a lot of attention, and they're part of what it is to be a British Columbian and a Canadian. We also have a number of introduced species. There's about 16 in British Columbia, 17 if you include the American shad. These are things like the largemouth bass, the snakehead, or the pacu. These sometimes are introduced on purpose for recreational fishing opportunities. The basses were introduced many years ago. We don't introduce them anymore, but they have established in some lakes in southern Vancouver Island and the Kootenays and places like that. The snakehead and the pacu are typically accidental releases, or not necessarily accidental, but people release them. You may remember the story a few years ago of the snakehead that got in Trout, not Trout Lake. I think it was Burnaby Lake or a lake somewhere in the lower mainland, and all hell broke loose because they're very, very voracious predators and could wipe out a local fish species pretty quickly. So we don't want those things, non-native fishes in our area. Okay, and we tend to organize, not only do the different regions of North America, the different provinces in Canada or territories have different number of species, but British Columbia tends to be, is often recognized as existing of these 8 different aquatic ecozones. And I've got them listed here on the left, and these are the number of native species in them. And you can see that some places like the Mackenzie and the Columbia River have very large numbers of native species, freshwater fishes, and other regions like Haida Gwaii and Vancouver Island have relatively small numbers of native freshwater fish species. And the reason for this has to do with the size of the areas. The Mackenzie is the largest in British Columbia. The Fraser region is the largest that's wholly contained within British Columbia. It also has to do with the degree of connectedness from other areas like the Mississippi. Certainly the Mackenzie was connected to the Mississippi at one point. So fishes should get there, and sometimes they can't. And the coastal islands are interesting ones. And here's a classic example. So this is the long-nosed sucker. It can get to about as long as your computer screen, certainly, or a foot and a half long. And I've just shown here the distribution of these fish widely across British Columbia on the mainland. However, they are not found on either of the coastal islands. In fact, Haida Gwaii and Vancouver Island have no native minnows or no native suckers in them. Actually, they have one species of minnow, the P-mouth chub. And the minnows and carps and suckers are one of the more diverse groups of fishes in freshwater, yet none of them made it to Vancouver Island and none of them made it to Haida Gwaii. And the reason for this is we tend to break fishes up, freshwater fishes, into 3 groups. Primary, those that are only found in freshwater. Secondary, those that are mostly found in freshwater, but sometimes go for brief periods into saline water. And peripheral freshwater fishes. And these are fishes that can live in both and actually spend considerable time in freshwater and marine systems. Classic examples here are salmon that can go between freshwater and marine systems. So all the minnows and carps, which are and suckers, which are a very diverse group of fishes, they're all so-called primary freshwater fish. If you put them in salt water, they'll shrivel up and die and look like a prune. All the moisture in them gets sucked out. And the reason we're pretty sure why there are none of these fish on Vancouver Island or Haida Gwaii is when the ice left, there was a lot of outflow of water, fresh water. And that fresh water flooded areas in the Strait of Georgia, Salish Sea, etc. And after the ice left, there's a time period before the land rebounds, because this huge 3-kilometer thick sheet of ice is a lot of weight. It tends to depress the land. When the ice recedes, the land rebounds. And when that happens, and often before that happens, as the ice leaves, there's fresh water draining off, but the sea will then flood in because the land is depressed, and that allows the sea to flood in. So what this distribution shows is clearly that the minnows and carps could not reach Vancouver Island because they can't handle salt water, or Haida Gwaii. They didn't arrive in time in British Columbia to take advantage of the freshwater outfall. They got there when the sea had already flooded in, and they couldn't make it because they'd shrivel up and die like a prune. So again, an example of the dynamic nature of things. So that's basically the summary of freshwater fishes. How do you tell them apart if you're angling, or if you're snorkeling, or if you're visiting a spawning ground in the fall? Well, we have a couple of resources. One is, which I'm showing here also, this little pamphlet it's a waterproof foldable guide with lots of illustrations of all the native freshwater fishes of British Columbia. It's got little notes, as you can see here, nice, beautiful pictures all put together by Derek Tan, and little brief bits of text on what the major morphological features are and where they're found in British Columbia. And to identify a fish, it's very, very important to know where you are. Now, that may sound silly, but many of the fishes, as I tried to illustrate in the previous slides, are found in some areas of British Columbia, but not in other ones. So if you know where you are, you can often eliminate a lot of the confusing choices of fishes that it might be, and you hone down to a smaller subset of fishes. So this is available either via PayPal or in the museum shop, and all the proceeds, I'm not going to retire on this, All the proceeds go to the freshwater fish collection, or the fish collection, including marine fishes, in the museum. Okay, now the last thing I wanted to talk about is this phone app that we've created. Again, this was Patrick Martone in botany. If you've ever used his seaweed sorter, it's very, very good. And he's the brains behind all the programming for all this. I just assembled the pictures and wrote the text. But Fish Sorter, which is available for iPhone and Android devices, is an easy to understand illustrated guide that it's not a traditional key. It asks you certain questions, and I'll show you what it looks like in a second. And it assumes no prior knowledge, allows you to skip questions if you don't either understand the question because I bungled the wording, or you want to move on to something else. It's updated regularly. It has more than 200 photos of characters and the species. Once you download it, it's only it's relatively small. You don't need an internet connection, so you can take it anywhere. And it's available on the Apple Store and Google Play for $5.50. So it's half the value of this. And we try and update this guide once a year, but that means you got to buy another one. Whereas Fish Sorter, you get free upgrades, updates all the time. Just download to your phone. Okay, so this is how it works. So here's the start screen. You press a question. If you hit the question, you come to this screen, which shows you basically how the thing works. So it shows you a picture, and you answer basic questions about, does this fish have this feature or not? And you hit yes, not sure, no, or you can end. There's a species list. You hit that, it gives you all the species at once, and you hit start, and we'll come to this third screen on the right. Yes, third screenshot. This is the first screen you see. And what it asks you is, does the fish, I got to move my thing, does the fish have an adipose fin or a healed scar bump where the adipose fin should be? So the circle shows you the trait that you're looking for. So you're looking for this little tiny little bumpy fin here between the dorsal fin and the caudal fin. And usually we almost always have the opposite condition. So the X means the fish does not have an adipose fin. And you'll notice here it says species remaining 89. And if you hit end right away, it takes you to a list of all the species with their pictures, and you can just poke on the picture and you learn about the fish. So we hit yes, it takes you we're going to use 4 screens to get to the pygmy whitefish. So you hit yes, because the fish I'm looking at, assuming it does have an adipose fin, you hit yes. So we're asking this question, and it'll take us to the next screen. And here's the list of all the different species and a picture, and you just poke your finger on it, and it takes you to a screen that I'll show you in a second. That's if you hit, the blue circle means if I hit end, it's going to take me to here. So let's continue. I'm going to say, I've got a fish, and I'm going to say, well, I look at the fish and I'd see no fin here at all. So I'm going to hit no. This takes you to the next screen, which is the second question. And you'll notice we've gone now from 89 species to only 56 species. So we've eliminated almost 30 species right off the bat by this one simple question. We still got 56 to go through. I look at the fish, and again, it says, does it have are there 2 or more spines in the fins or top of the body? And it shows you here, and it's got a nice illustration by Derek about what a spine looks like and feels like. So I'm going to I push my button yes, because it does, and it takes you to the next screen. Then it says, is the fish tadpole shaped with fan-like pectoral fins and eyes on top of the head? And this is basically, you look at this fish, well, yeah, it kind of looks shaped like a tadpole. It's got fan-like pectoral fins, which you can't see too well. And are the eyes on top of the head? Well, you can see, yeah, they sort of are. So I'm going to hit yes. And it takes you to this next question, next screen. And this is where I chose this one on purpose because we use the geographic distribution. So now we've gone from 20 species, because I said it had a spine. So we've gone from 89 to 56 to now 20. And I'm saying, yes, it is tadpole shaped and it does have eyes and head, etc. That takes me to this screen. Now we're down to only 9 species. So we know it's some kind of sculpin, of which there are 9 in BC. And then it asks you a question, is the fish from the Flathead River? And you've got a nice, beautiful map here where the Flathead River is. So this is where you need to know where you are. And in fact, I'm at the Flathead River. I'm snorkeling and I saw this fish. I'm going to say, yeah, well, actually, I am in the Flathead River. I hit yes. Go to the next screen. And now we're down to only 2 species. So the Flathead River is an interesting one because it's only got 2 species of sculpins in British Columbia. So I could hit end here at any time and it would give me the choice of the 2, and I could look at the pictures, read the description, and figure out. It says here, is the anal fin short with 10 to 12 deeply indented rays? And the top one is always the affirmative to this. And I go, oh, okay, I can count those pretty easy. I think there's 12. And they're deeply indented. You can see there's little deep grooves here, or gaps between each of these spines. And down here, you can't see it so much, so there's an X through there. And I hit yes, and it immediately eliminates the one species that doesn't have this trait and takes me to the species that I've now identified, which is Caudus cognatus, the slimy sculpin. And it gives you the picture, it gives you the classification, it gives you a description of the species, usually with some key characters and something about its distribution. And let's see, I should be able to go one more. Oh, no, I don't. Sorry, I've got this damn menu in front of me, it's hard to see. This is, I split the resulting screen into 2 shots. So this is the top of the screen that shows you a picture of the fish and a nice close-up of the head. And the bottom of the screen that starts down here gives you the rest of the description. It also tells you what it's confused with commonly, and it will also tell you if it used to have a different species or scientific or common name. So that's fish sorter, how it works. And even if you just go end right away and it takes you to, I'm just going to finish here now. If it takes you to, oh, there we go, the list of all the different species, you can look at the pictures, you can kind of decide. I mean, clearly a sturgeon is not going to look anything like a catfish. So you can kind of hone in right away. If you just go to, if you hit end right away, it takes you to the list and you can kind of figure it out. Sometimes like a bird, like those bird books, you're always just looking at the pictures, it seems. So this is fish sorter. It's $5.50. All the proceeds go to the fish collection. I do have a bunch of vouchers for free copies. If you have an Android device, you just email me and I'll send you a code which you can put in at the Google Play Store and you'll get a free copy of it. So I'm going to stop my share. We got interrupted by a clown a bit there. So I got lots of time for questions if you do.
Awesome. Thank you, Rick. That was wonderful. I don't know why I never thought of how complicated it could be to figure out what fish were in BC. It makes sense. I mean, I know about the Cordilleran ice cap and all that kind of stuff, but it didn't occur to me that there would have been so many influxes from so many different areas, including.
That's pretty cool about it when you think about it.
Yeah, but including one of the comments in the chat where someone was saying they didn't know there were marine sculpins, and my perspective was I didn't know there were freshwater sculpins. So that's pretty interesting right off the bat. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. In fact, there's something like 300 species of marine sculpins, maybe slightly fewer, and less than about a tenth of that of freshwater. So they're clearly a family of marine origin that has colonized into freshwater. So you tend to see them in coastal areas, not so much in the inland, but there's a few exceptions.
Right. So let's see what we've got here. Anyone is wanting to put in their questions? This is, the Pacu, Kashifa was noticing. They're really interesting looking. Were they released? Where were they released in BC?
Right. A lot of people grow them in, so they're related to piranha, but they're completely vegetarian. A lot of them just eat fruit and stuff. They've been a couple of times on Vancouver. I know Great Central Lake had one in it, and people immediately thought it was a piranha and freaked out, but it wasn't. So because they're popular aquarium fishes, and they can grow to quite large size, they can get too big. And people, their hearts are in the right place, it's just their brains aren't in the right place. So instead of euthanizing the fish and maybe donating it to a museum, they release it into freshwater, which is absolutely the wrong thing to do. And it's actually against the law.
So that's interesting because I had looked at the introduced species and they vary in size from pretty small to huge. And so you had mentioned in some situations, well, just now, released because they didn't know what to do with it. But I think it seemed like some of those were coming from the aquarium trade.
Yes,
And the
yes, yes.
fish perhaps got too big for their tanks. And so then
Yep.
they just ended up releasing them, right?
Yep, yep. And sometimes people, well, there's a famous case of, yeah, well, there are people who study this, but one of the key vectors in Canada is definitely releases from the aquarium trade. Now, most fish like the pacu, because it's from Amazonia, it just ain't going to handle the winters. So they die. But the snakehead, which is from northern China, I think, certainly could live in lower mainland BC rivers. There's the oriental weatherfish, which is a loach, a long, skinny thing with a tiny little mouth and little whiskers. They're in the South Alouette. They're also, I think, from sort of the Korean Peninsula area, and they certainly have established in the Alouette, so they can handle the cold waters, that sort of thing. Yeah. How many of the freshwater fish? There's oh yeah. Okay, if you want a couple of questions here first. If you want the Android code coupon, can you email me, because I'm not going to be able to get it here from the chat. So or email, or somebody maybe you can put it in the chat and just someone can save it who knows what they're doing, and I'll send you a coupon. So, or you can just look at my email address, etaylor@zoology.ubc.ca. Email me and I'll send you a code. How many threatened? How many freshwater fish species and beasts are threatened or endangered? I'll answer the second part first. The biggest threats are habitat loss and habitat destruction by far. Generally, our freshwater fish species are with the exception of salmon, are managed pretty well. So it's not overexploitation, it's definitely habitat loss. And there's probably, well, if you include the salmon, there's, there's 30 Chinook salmon populations, but 10 of those are threatened. Sockeye, there's around 14 that are threatened or endangered. So I'm going to take a wild guess, maybe 100 species, and this includes these distinct populations. That's why it's more than 67. Maybe 100 have been assessed in BC, and like at least 70% of those are at some level of risk, special concern, threatened, or endangered. So, and we've had a couple of extinctions. The sticklebacks on Hadley Lake on Lasqueti Island, someone had an ornamental pond with little catfish in it, and a flood came, the catfish got out, went down into the lake and ate all the sticklebacks.
Right. Yeah, and that's not an uncommon story for many.
That's not an uncommon story,
right? And does that include, I'm guessing, the salmon in terms of the declines in our salmon populations? Do you think that's also due to habitat destruction in further up in their home streams?
There are definitely there's some cases, specific areas where that's an issue, but generally not. It's more reduced ocean survival for reasons we don't quite understand. Climate change and regime shifts in the ocean are a big issue, but even if you drop the exploitation rate, which has been dropped by fisheries in BC, particularly in the Fraser River, the return rate is still exceptionally low. It's something to do mostly with changes in the marine environment, lowered survival, although certainly, warming of the Fraser River, which is warmed by about 2 degrees, particularly the lower Fraser River that has a lot of pollution and habitat loss problems. That's definitely a problem for salmon, though, certainly the lower Fraser River, but in the upper watershed, still pretty darn good.
Well, sorry, wasn't Chinook extirpated from some area? Did I see that in
Oh, well, indeedy. Well, consider this fact. When Grand Coulee Dam went in on the main stem Columbia River in the US, basically one third of the entire Columbia River watershed, which was in Canada, the salmon populations that used to go right up to Columbia Lake, right at the base of the Rocky Mountains, the western slope of the Rocky Mountains, all those salmon populations went extinct, gone completely. And there's one tiny little remnant left in the Okanagan River in British Columbia. There's lots of Chinook in the lower parts of the Columbia in the US, but in Canada, there's a population of under 100 fish in the Okanagan River out of a species that used to go all the way to the foot of the Rocky Mountains.
Wow, right, okay.
Habitat loss mainly due to logging. It's not mainly due to logging, actually, I don't think. I mean, certainly there are issues, particularly in the past, there were big issues with logging. They've cleaned up their act a fair bit. Most of the habitat loss, the worst habitat loss, is due to residential and commercial development in the Lower Mainland, in the Okanagan Valley, and in southern Vancouver Island. It's definitely not logging, although logging can be an issue in certain spots.
Right. Here's one, introduced species. There is a very real goldfish problem in Dragon Lake in Quesnel, decimating the trout population. Are you familiar with that at all?
I'm certainly, I've got a couple of stories about that. I've heard about that. I don't think, and I could be wrong, but I don't think, well, first of all, Dragon Lake was poisoned by humans 50 years ago to get rid of all the coarse fish in there. And by coarse fish, I mean whitefish, to stock it with rainbow trout.
Oh.
So if anybody, so first of all, someone put goldfish in there, that's a boo-boo. But many decades before that, we killed every fish in the lake on purpose by poisoning it to stock it with rainbow trout. Now, as far as I know, it's still a pretty good brood lake. So they put and this goes to one of the other questions. So rainbow trout, kokanee, West Slope cutthroat trout, steelhead trout. I might be missing one. I don't think so. Those are the four things that are raised in hatcheries, in freshwater hatcheries in BC, that are dumped in lakes, some lakes. Dragon Lake is a place where they take fish from the Blackwater River and they put them in Dragon Lake because they've poisoned everything and cleaned up the lake. And they use that as a so-called brood lake. So they go in there every year and seine up a bunch of fish, spawn them, and then spread their offspring in other lakes in BC. Very, very important. The Blackwater strain is a very, very important stocking strain in British Columbia. Any of you fish around the Little Fort area, Highway 24, the so-called fishing highway, a lot of those fish are Blackwater / Dragon Lake origin. So I don't think it's true that goldfish have decimated the trout population in Dragon Lake. They may be a problem, but they haven't decimated it. And you shouldn't put goldfish in any lake. So I agree with you there.
So it sounds like, sorry, like Dragon Lake is a bit of an experimental lake for 50 years. If they, like, is that the only one that was totally decimated purposely to
I don't think so. So that's the only one I know of. No, there were several lakes that were poisoned, with all the right intentions, and that was the state of thinking of fisheries management at the time. So on Dragon Lake, they wiped out a couple of populations of lake whitefish that were very distinct in that lake. But we tend not to do that. We don't do that sort of thing anymore.
Okay, another one about, sorry, what about agriculture? Those reared in hatcheries, you mentioned that. What about agriculture? Is that having an effect on species demise, or?
It certainly can through two principal means. One is excessive water withdrawals and irrigation. Big issue in the Similkameen Valley, the Okanagan Valley, places that are basically desert anyway. Also runoff of fertilizer and animal waste into rivers. That's a big issue. The Lower Mainland, it's a huge issue. There's oxygen loss and toxicity of some areas through sometimes improper monitoring of fertilizer use and animal waste, etc. in the Lower Mainland. It's a big, big issue for sure. Yeah. I mean, agriculture, we all need it, but it can do some really bad stuff. There's a question here about Asian carp. Are there any dangers of Asian carp invasion? I doubt it. Things can change. There's an example. So the American shad, which George Washington used to feed his troops during the American Revolutionary War, which are native to the East Coast, were introduced to the Sacramento River sometime in the 1800s, and they took off. they spread to the Columbia River in Washington, Oregon. And the Columbia River, which at one time had a salmon population of 18 to 20 million, it's estimated, was probably the center, the greatest river in the Pacific Rim for Chinook salmon. Now that shad, this introduced species from the East Coast, outnumber all salmon species in the Columbia River put together. And that includes all the hatchery fish. Most of the salmon in the Columbia River are hatchery fish. And now, there might be 5 million that come back every year. The American shad number is sometimes as high as 30 million fish. Whoa. So that it's now the most dominant fish species in the Columbia River, is a fish that came from the East Coast of the US.
And very predatory at the same time.
Yeah, and the point is, why is he talking about that? I asked him about Asian carp. The point about that is only very rarely there's 30 million of these darn things in the Columbia River. And we know that sturgeon move back and forth between the Columbia and the Fraser. And so far, it's very, very rare to see any American shad in the Fraser River. But if the temperature changes a little bit, the habitat changes a little bit, there are 30 million of those things up to waiting at the front door to get into the Fraser River. So in terms of the Asian carp, which are a little bit more warm water-ish fish, I don't think there's a huge danger of that right now, but there certainly is in the Great Lakes, where they're right in the Michigan, I think it's the Chicago River, and has a canal that dumps into the Great Lakes. Doesn't used to, but it does now. And they've got all sorts of poisons and electrical barriers, and everybody's freaking out to try and keep these things from entering the Great Lakes, which they have occasionally, but they haven't taken off yet. So no danger immediately of the Asian carp, but let's not be sanguine about it.
Well, also, if water temperatures are slowly increasing,
yes,
as with climate change, and as I think we've already noted in the Fraser River, then that's not a good future potential, that they may end up being able to feel more comfortable in what were cooler waters, but are now warmer. I'm just going to say, Rick, we are past 2. And
can I answer one more question?
Yes, please.
Just the very last one here. Are there particular locations you can recommend for good viewing for freshwater diversity? Well, as I mentioned, if you haven't been to the Adams River Run at Roderick Hague Park, just west of Kamloops, I'm not sure this is a big year, but you should definitely go there. You'll see, hopefully, millions of sockeye salmon spawning in beautiful fall colors right at your feet. Closer, there's the the Weaver Creek spawning channel. Just type in Weaver Creek spawning channel in Google and it'll take you to it. It's a DFO site. It's quite nice, easy drive, beautiful drive out there on Low Heat Highway. You'll see 3 species of salmon there spawning this year. Although last year, the numbers, as you remember, in the Fraser were so darnly low. It was amazing how few fish there were, but that's a really good place to go. Any small stream you can get to with a mask and snorkel is really good to see. Just make sure you do it safely, because all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Well, that's really good suggestions there. And I have to say,
Adams River Run. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I have tons of other questions for you, but I think they'll have to hold on to it for another occasion. And I'm really interested in that American shad complication in the whole salmon stream or sort of salmon species survival. That's something that I hadn't been aware of at all. So I think we've covered most everything. Someone just had a comment to say thank you very much. They were
thank you.
Thanks. Sorry,
we coped well with the disruption, I think. Sorry, I got a bit flummoxed by that myself, but
oh my, yeah, exactly.
Crazy world.
So here, no question, just wanted to say thanks so much for this. I moved here years ago and didn't know much about BC fish at all. This was excellent information. A few
Support
other
fishes and buy a guide. They make great stocking stuffers.
It is. It's fantastic. I've looked through it and keyed out a few myself. And what was nice is if you go to the species list, you do get the common names as well.
Yeah.
I discovered that. So I'm thinking, we've got a few more, a number of other thank yous. Love this presentation. Thank you. Time for the stickleback. Where are we? Time for the, oh yes, there was a question on sticklebacks. Are you familiar with any more updates on what's been happening there?
Sticklebacks they're so passé. It's char where the action is. Dolly Varden and Arctic Char working on that. That's a whole new blog. But you should talk to Dolph Schluter. He's the stickleback man. But if you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me.
Okay. All right. I think good. Okay, Nancy, you got that. I think we're done. And Nancy, I think you may have saved the chat. I was going to save.